The town of Havens Bay was known for its serene coastline, dotted with small fishing boats and weathered cottages. But as picturesque as it appeared, there was a sinister legend that lingered in the whispers of the townsfolk. They spoke of the figure in the fog, a ghostly apparition that wandered the shores whenever the mist rolled in thick from the sea. It was said that anyone who saw the figure would never be seen again, at least, not in the way they once were. The townspeople avoided the fog like a plague. On those nights when the air grew thick with moisture, doors would be locked, and windows bolted shut. The once busy streets would empty, and an eerie silence would take hold. It wasn't just the fear of getting lost in the mist, it was the unshakable feeling that something lurked within it, waiting for its next victim. Evelyn Carter, a young journalist from the city, was unfamiliar with the old tales. She had come to Havens Bay to write a piece on the decline of small coastal towns, curious about their slow fade into obscurity. But soon after her arrival, she heard the unsettling rumors about the figure in the fog. Unlike the locals, who had grown weary of the legend, Evelyn was intrigued. The skeptic in her dismissed the idea as mere superstition, a story concocted to explain the strange disappearances that had plagued the town for decades. Her curiosity grew as she interviewed locals, gathering bits and pieces of the legend. Some spoke of loved ones lost to the mist, while others refused to even mention the figure, their faces pale with fear. Still, despite the warnings, Evelyn was determined to uncover the truth. After all, a good story was always worth a little risk. That's how she found herself standing on the shore one foggy night, staring out into the swirling mist, her breath catching in her throat. She had come to see for herself, to prove that there was nothing more than the imagination at play. But as the wind howled and the fog grew thicker, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled as a dark silhouette appeared in the distance, moving closer, ever so slowly. Evelyn stood frozen on the beach, her heart racing as the figure in the distance moved closer, its shape barely discernible through the thick fog. At first, she thought it was just her mind playing tricks, perhaps a fisherman lost in the mist. But as the silhouette grew sharper, her pulse quickened with a cold, gnawing dread. There was something unnatural about the way it moved, gliding over the sand without any footsteps or sound. She took a step back, the soft sand shifting beneath her feet, and felt an overwhelming urge to flee. Every instinct in her body screamed for her to turn and run, but she couldn't. It was as if the mist itself was pulling her toward the figure, each breath she took tasting of salt and fear. The distant sound of the waves crashing against the shore felt far away, muted by the eerie silence that enveloped her. The figure continued to approach, its features still shrouded in shadow, but there was something undeniably human-like about it, or at least it seemed that way at first. Evelyn squinted, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Then, without warning, the figure stopped, just a few yards away. The fog swirled around it, twisting and curling as if alive, and Evelyn felt the air grow colder, almost unbearably so. Suddenly, the figure turned its head, and for the briefest moment, she saw its face, or rather, the lack of one. Where eyes, a mouth, or a nose should have been, there was only a void, a dark emptiness that seemed to absorb the light around it. Evelyn gasped, stumbling backward in shock. Her foot caught on a piece of driftwood, and she tumbled to the ground, the cold sand clinging to her palms as she scrambled to get back up. She finally managed to get to her feet, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The figure hadn't moved, but she could feel its gaze, or whatever passed for it, locked onto her. The air seemed heavier now, pressing down on her chest as if the fog itself were alive, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. Evelyn took one last look at the figure, then turned and bolted. She ran, her feet pounding against the sand, her eyes barely able to see more than a few feet ahead in the thick fog. The figure didn't follow, but the feeling of its presence clung to her like a shadow, unshakable and oppressive. Every step she took felt as though the mist was holding her back, slowing her down, and she didn't stop until she reached the small cottage she had rented just outside of town. Breathless and shaking, Evelyn slammed the door behind her, locking it tightly before collapsing onto the floor. Her heart pounded in her chest, the image of the faceless figure burned into her mind. She didn't know what she had seen, but one thing was clear: the legend of the figure in the fog was no mere superstition. It was real, and now, it knew she had seen it. For the next few days, Evelyn tried to shake the memory of that night. She told herself it was just her imagination, the power of suggestion at work after hearing the locals' warnings. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. The figure was out there, waiting, watching. And she feared it wouldn't be long before it came for her again. The days that followed Evelyn's encounter with the figure were filled with an uneasy tension that gripped her every waking moment. She couldn't concentrate on her work, and sleep was a distant memory. Each night, she found herself drawn to the window of her cottage, staring out at the ocean as if expecting the fog to roll in again, bringing the figure with it. But the fog didn't come, not yet. The nights were clear, and that only made her more anxious, as though the calm was a prelude to something far worse. Determined to understand what she had seen, Evelyn dove deeper into the town's history. She visited the local library, scouring old newspapers and archives for any mention of the figure. The more she uncovered, the more unsettling the story became. The disappearances had been happening for over a century, all tied to nights when the fog was thickest. Each time, the missing person was last seen near the shore, and the body was never found. But it wasn't just the disappearances that alarmed her. She found accounts from survivors, people who had glimpsed the figure but somehow managed to escape. Their descriptions varied, but they all agreed on one thing: once you saw the figure, you were marked. Those who lived spoke of feeling watched, haunted by an unseen presence. Some heard whispers in the night, others saw shadows in the corners of their homes where no one should be. One man claimed he saw the figure in his dreams, standing at the foot of his bed, silent and still, waiting for him to succumb to its pull. Evelyn's hands shook as she read their stories, the eerie similarities to her own experience too close for comfort. The figure didn't just take people, it consumed them, body and soul. Those who saw it were cursed, their fate sealed the moment their eyes met its hollow, faceless stare. Her mind raced as she pieced the clues together, and she came across a particularly chilling discovery. An old fisherman's journal, buried deep in the library's archives, described an encounter with the figure back in the late 1800s. The man had been the sole survivor of a crew lost to the mist, and his journal recounted in terrifying detail how the figure had taken his crewmates one by one. But there was something else, a cryptic passage at the end of the journal. The fisherman claimed that the figure wasn't just a ghost, but something older, something that thrived on fear and despair. It didn't just take lives, it took souls. With a growing sense of dread, Evelyn realized that her encounter had been no accident. The figure had chosen her, marked her as its next victim. And now, it was only a matter of time before it came back to claim her. The survivors in the accounts had described the same slow, creeping feeling of inevitability, like a shadow looming closer with each passing day. Some had tried to flee the town, only to find that the figure followed them, no matter how far they ran. Others had barricaded themselves in their homes, only to discover that the fog had a way of seeping in, no matter how tightly the doors were shut. Evelyn could feel the weight of the curse settling over her like a shroud. The figure wasn't done with her, and she knew it wouldn't be satisfied until it had taken everything. Desperation clawed at her, and she considered leaving Havens Bay altogether, abandoning her story and her investigation. But deep down, she knew there was no escape. The figure would find her, whether she stayed or not. One evening, as she sat in her cottage, her mind racing with fear and uncertainty, she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound at first, like the distant cry of a gull, but as the minutes ticked by, it grew louder. A low, mournful moan, carried on the wind. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest, and realized with horror what it was. The fog had returned. Slowly, she made her way to the window, her breath shallow as she peered through the glass. The mist was rolling in from the sea, thick and white, swallowing everything in its path. And there, just beyond the reach of the street lamp's dim glow, was the figure, standing motionless in the fog, waiting for her. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, curling around the edges of the glass, as if trying to find a way inside. Evelyn backed away from the window, her pulse racing, every instinct screaming at her to run. But where could she go? The figure was out there, waiting, and she knew that once it had come this close, there was no escaping it. She hurried to lock the door, her hands trembling as she turned the deadbolt. Her cottage had always felt small and cozy before, but now, it felt like a prison, one she couldn't escape. She sat down on the floor, her back pressed against the door, as if somehow that would keep it out. The silence that followed was deafening. No more wind, no more waves crashing in the distance. Just an eerie, unnatural stillness. Evelyn held her breath, listening, straining to hear any sign of movement outside. But the fog was thick and soundless, swallowing everything in its path. Suddenly, there was a creak from behind her. She froze, every muscle tensing as she slowly turned her head. The sound had come from inside the house. The floorboards creaked again, closer this time, and she realized with a jolt of terror that she wasn't alone. The figure hadn't waited outside, it had found its way in. Evelyn scrambled to her feet, backing away from the door, her eyes darting around the small room. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners, shapes forming and dissolving as the dim light from the kitchen flickered. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts as she fumbled for her phone, hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She had to call someone, anyone, but the moment she unlocked the screen, it went black. The battery was full, but the phone wouldn't turn on. A cold sweat broke out on the back of her neck as a familiar dread crept over her. The figure was closer now, she could feel it, though she couldn't see it. It was as if the air had thickened, the atmosphere growing oppressive and stifling. She stumbled into the kitchen, her mind racing for a plan, anything that might give her a chance to survive. But deep down, she knew there was nothing she could do. The figure had already claimed her. As she backed into the counter, the room grew colder, her breath forming clouds in front of her face. Then, in the reflection of the kitchen window, she saw it, a dark silhouette standing just behind her, its head tilted slightly to one side as if observing her. She whipped around, her heart slamming against her ribs, but the figure was gone. The room was empty, save for the oppressive fog that seemed to cling to the walls, seeping in through the cracks. Evelyn's mind spun as the weight of her situation settled in. The figure was toying with her, dragging out her fear, feeding off her terror. Every step she took felt heavier, like wading through quicksand. She backed into the living room, her eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, waiting for the figure to appear again. And then it did. This time, it was in the hallway, just a few feet away. The same faceless void stared back at her, its presence so overwhelming that Evelyn felt her knees buckle beneath her. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but the longer she stared at it, the more it seemed to grow, its form stretching and distorting until it filled the hallway. Desperate, she stumbled toward the front door, her fingers fumbling with the lock as she tried to throw it open. But no matter how hard she pulled, the door wouldn't budge. It was as though the fog had seeped into the lock itself, jamming it tight. She turned back toward the figure, her chest heaving with panic, but it was gone again, the hallway empty. For a brief moment, Evelyn allowed herself to hope that it had left. But then she felt it, a cold breath on the back of her neck, so close it made the hairs stand up. Slowly, she turned her head, her body frozen with terror. The figure was right behind her now, towering over her, its faceless void inches from her own. Evelyn screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed through the small cottage. But no one could hear her. The fog had swallowed everything, and now, it had come to claim its prize. Evelyn's scream echoed through the small cottage, but there was no one to hear it. The figure loomed over her, a formless shadow that seemed to draw the very air from the room. She stumbled backward, her legs weak and trembling, barely able to hold herself up as she backed into the wall. Her mind raced, desperate for a way out, but every exit seemed blocked by the dense fog that now filled the room like a living thing. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath, but the cold, oppressive presence of the figure was overwhelming. It was as if the air itself had turned to ice, chilling her to the bone. Evelyn could feel her strength waning, her will to fight slipping away as the figure inched closer, the void where its face should have been drawing her in like a black hole. But something inside her snapped. This wasn't how it was going to end. She wasn't going to let this thing take her without a fight. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, Evelyn pushed herself off the wall and bolted for the back door, her feet barely touching the ground as she sprinted through the fog-filled house. The figure seemed to shift and stretch, blocking her path at every turn, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Not now. The back door was locked, but she didn't care. With all her strength, she slammed her shoulder into it, the wood splintering under the force. The door flew open, and Evelyn stumbled outside, gasping for air as she collapsed onto the damp grass. The cold night air bit at her skin, but the fog was still there, thick and swirling, wrapping around her like a suffocating shroud. She pushed herself to her feet, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she stumbled toward the beach. There was nowhere else to go. The figure was inside her home, inside her mind, and the only place left to face it was where it all began. The shore. The fog followed her, thick and unrelenting, as she made her way down the narrow path toward the water. Her feet sank into the sand as she reached the beach, the sound of the crashing waves barely audible through the oppressive mist. The figure was there, waiting for her, just as she knew it would be. It stood at the water's edge, still and silent, its faceless void watching her as she approached. Evelyn stopped a few yards away, her heart pounding in her chest. The wind whipped through her hair, cold and biting, but she stood her ground. She wasn't running anymore. She was done being afraid. "What do you want?" she shouted, her voice hoarse and trembling. The figure didn't respond, didn't move. It simply stood there, watching her, the fog swirling around its form. Evelyn took a step closer, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You've taken so many," she said, her voice breaking. "But not me. Not tonight. For a long moment, there was silence. And then, slowly, the figure began to move. It didn't walk, didn't glide, its form simply shifted, drawing closer to her in a way that defied reason. The void where its face should have been seemed to expand, drawing in the light, the air, everything around it. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as the figure loomed over her, its presence so overwhelming that she could feel her knees buckling beneath her. But she didn't back down. She stood her ground, her gaze locked onto the faceless void. This was it. This was the moment it would take her. And then, something strange happened. The figure paused, its formless body stilling as if in hesitation. The air around them seemed to shift, the oppressive weight lifting for just a moment. Evelyn blinked, confused, her heart racing. Was it waiting? She took a step forward, the sand shifting beneath her feet. "You won't take me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I won't let you." The figure didn't move. For a brief, surreal moment, it almost seemed to retreat, the fog swirling around it in confusion. Evelyn felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could escape this. Maybe the curse wasn't as inevitable as she'd believed. But then, the figure lunged. It happened so fast that Evelyn barely had time to react. The void expanded, consuming everything in its path, and before she could scream, the world went dark. The next morning, the fog had lifted, and the beach was empty, save for the soft crash of the waves against the shore. Evelyn was gone, her footprints disappearing into the sand where the mist had swallowed her whole. The town would speak of her in hushed tones, another victim of the figure in the fog. But this time, there would be no body to find.